We're talking crime today, so brace yourself. Welcome to the LocoFoco Netcast. My name is Timothy Verkala. Today, Lee Waaks is going to interview criminologist Brendan Dooley of Mount St. Mary's University. We have some questions about crime and poverty and sociology and what is going on in this world. And can we make sense of it? And do criminologists have anything to offer? I'm going to stay in the background here. I'm going to let Lee ask some questions and Brendan talk. I may horn in a few times, but forget about me. Let's get into this thing, eh?
Well, thanks for coming on, Brendan Dooley. We're going to start out with a question.
Sure.
What is criminology?
So the classic definition, and I've cited this a few times in some of the work that I do, because a lot of my work actually concentrates on precisely this question. It's been defined as by one of the leading lights in all of criminology, a man named Edwin Sutherland, as a systematic study of three things. Systematic study of the causes of crime, the definition of crime, the reaction of crime, and the reaction to crime. So there's a lot going on within that tripartite definition there. First, there's this issue of defining crime. So there's a political process that spits this thing out. Secondarily, there's this issue of the reaction to crime, which involves all the criminal justice processes, which also has an underpinning of political power that influences that as well. So the issue of the causes of crime also includes this issue of more philosophical kind of inquiry in terms of what is the baseline assumption of human nature. So that's oftentimes lost in the conversation because pretty much the conversation begins from the position of we've designated this list of things as being criminal behavior, so we need to do something about that. And so a lot of my work attempts to kind of revisit some of the philosophical underpinnings, the philosophical foundations for how we got to this particular position. A lot of that work is dominated by what goes under the rubric of critical criminology or radical criminology. There's been a variety of different handles that have been used over the course of the years to depict that particular crowd that is generally suspicious of sort of what are called positivist assumptions, which would indicate there that we could apply scientific technology and scientific mechanisms and methodologies to understanding what results in or what animates criminal behavior. And if we understand that, then we can develop a set of policy suggestions or policy solutions that can hopefully successfully intervene to suppress and reduce those kinds of vexatious behaviors. So there's a power dynamic, there's a power element. There's also a fundamental issue here in terms of, is Hobbes right, or is someone like Marx more right here in terms of the fundamental leanings of human behavior? Is it fundamentally altruistic, as the critical folks would suggest, or is it something that's a little bit more, self-serving? I did an interview with one of the leading lights in that domain, a man named Jackson Toby, in my video up at oralhistoryofcriminology.org. He famously, or infamously, depending on your particular position, refers to humankind and human nature as we're all a bunch of self-serving bastards. That's egocentric bastards is the enduring kind of thing that rings in my memory, resonates in my memory with that formulation here. So those are the kinds.
I've been called that before. So
yeah. It's really is an enduring question, and so I think it's important for us to kind of keep that in mind here. One of my great heroes in the field, a man named Travis Hershey, was famous for leaning into the Hobbesian kind of orientation and saying that we don't need all these assumptions about what motivates or animates these kinds of behaviors. It's just a baseline assumption from him, and so he starts the inquiry from that particular position. And his attempt is actually ultimately to explain conformity on one end of the spectrum. Most of the field, the dominant breadth of the field, would much rather focus attention because of sort of an ideological position, or sort of their a priori assumptions indicate that it'd be better for them, or it suits their worldview a little bit better to suggest there that there are all these things that exist in the world, or that are maybe even innate in us, in the social context, in the social fabric, and the political nature of things that result in these things being brought about. And so they're attempting to kind of figure out what is it about the systems that we find ourselves enmeshed in, or social encounters that are just part of the sort of the human condition that need to be tweaked, adjusted, altered in some fundamental way. So, which ultimately brings into the equation the use of the allocation of governmental power. So it's oftentimes it's an undercurrent, it's an implicit assumption that's embedded in the conversation. But I think it'd be more helpful if the field would dedicate more of its energies to actually making that a little bit more explicit. And it could do that productively without having to buy in lock, stock, and barrel with critical theory assumptions. So I'm trying to figure out a way in which to kind of make the peace between the differing factions here to suggest that there's maybe a third way forward here in terms of creating new lines of inquiry that would hopefully be more productive rather than having these sort of like these pitched battles between the critical camp and the dominant portion of the field's research enterprise.
Randall Collins, in his book on four sociological traditions, talks about four theories. He doesn't talk about two you're discussing here. And his are the Durkheimian perspective, the conflict theory perspective, the micro-interactionist tradition, which I guess is Goffman and that crowd, and then rational choice and economic view of the world. Do you see those as playing in criminology?
I think criminology has largely removed itself from the ambit of sociology. I've written a couple of pieces on this. I've got one actually out under review that goes back to the well to kind of explain or kind of think through the implications of that professional divide. I think in some ways that still exists in the backdrop of what we've got going on here. There are a handful of sociology programs that actually intentionally invest that effort in training up new graduates, newly minted PhDs in those traditions by actually going back to the written the earlier Sanskrit, right? I can probably count them on one hand. There's the University of Washington, the University of Minnesota, Ohio State. Iowa has a concentration, but beyond that, it's pretty thin. So practically speaking, what we have in criminology is an attempt to create its own canons and its own kind of intellectual tradition. It's got its own vault, if you will, that it will encourage its up-and-coming graduate students to actually visit. The only reason I'm familiar with Randall Collins' work is largely because I actually went back and actually read the citation that you actually offered there. Very few have the inclination to do that. I think it's just a natural result of the continuing professionalization of the field. So you would probably throw a stock citation in that direction to say that, yeah, okay, I understand that there's sort of this sociological embeddedness of this particular inquiry, but by and large, most of us sort of catapult forward at least 2 or 3 generations in terms of where we begin the conversation with that. The attempt these days is to, again, this is just a natural outgrowth. It's sort of neither here nor there about things, although a lot of folks have gripes here, there, and elsewhere with how this thing is progressing. A lot of people will begin from a position that we've got this narrow band of inquiry that we're attempting to promote or lead into. So certain kinds of institutions or certain kinds of programs will have particular research questions that occupy the lion's share of their faculty. Others will be much more interested in sort of hewing a rather narrow bandwidth of things and having their graduate students immerse themselves in that. It might be a community-oriented focus. It might be an interpersonal violence, and so they would draw on the Goffman. It might be a systemic thing where it would be sort of like, let's pull some Max Weber out off the shelf here and play around with and implement some of those kinds of ideas. but by and large, the field is kind of working into its own orbit. So it's it's multidisciplinary, it's interdisciplinary, arguably as well. So you'll see criminologists of all different stripes sort of come to the table and attempt to kind of insert and inject and proselytize for their own approach to things.
I'm going to ask you if you recognize a line from a famous musical. We're depraved on account of we're deprived.
Yeah, that's
you know what
the
that's
Sharks and the Jets. That's West Side Story, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So
that's from the early '60s. Is that right, Timo?
Late 50s, I think.
Was that late '50s when that came out? Late '50s. So going all the way back, more than 50 years ago now, we see that view that poverty, basically poverty causes crime.
Yeah.
Why do you think it started out that way? I mean, why do you think that this particular point of view is written into a script? Where do you think that's coming from? That particular view.
So I've encountered that numerous times. I knew that just because I've seen it. It's everywhere in the gang literature, and I began my career actually studying gangs. So some of my early work actually deals with street gang affiliation and the overlay of correctional issues. So I studied reoffending patterns with a group of probationers, and then I studied with a group of prisoners alongside some of that work I've done with Dave Scarbeck, who's now at Brown University. But you see that citation nearly everywhere, and the way that I read that is that it's an excuse that they're offering, right? It's a form of legitimization. They have a larger grievance, and I think that it resonates with a larger population, and I think that it has innate and intuitive appeal, something like that. You can go back to.
Sorry.
You can go back to probably a canonical definition of that with the explanation of the Lumpenproletariat with someone like Karl Marx, right? Who's attempting to embed this larger sociological phenomenon in these massive macro machinations of history and historical evolution. I think the short answer to the question here is I think it's just intuitively appealing. I think there's just a sort of an intuitive sense that people are motivated by these kinds of larger factors. So you see this come about from time to time. I think the most recent occurrence with this, the present situation with the pandemic, accepted would be the mortgage meltdown of 2008, where you had people who were inclined to draw attention to the potential for this economic collapse to have these sort of knock-on effects.
We didn't see that though, did we? Was that counted as a refutation, so to speak?
Yeah, it's always anticipated. It's kind of like the age-old joke about economists, right? They predicted 3 of the last 2 recessions or something like that, right? So there's this sort of this an intuitive, innate kind of draw towards that kind of thing. It's one way in which we can excuse that kind of behavior in some sense. It's one way we can also not to excuse it on sort of a normative level, but more on a more analytic plane to kind of wrap our mind around why so many people who wouldn't naturally or otherwise be inclined to engage in those kinds of behaviors to act in sort of in an uncharacteristic fashion. It's one way in which we sort of displace the motivating factor. We draw that out from the individual and we displace that out into larger society. It gives us some hope, I guess, that we can, through the manipulation of economic processes in some ways, reduce or undermine the inclination to engage in those kinds of behaviors. I studied under one of the leaders in this line of theorizing, a man named Richard Rosenfeld. He's got a famous book. I think it's probably past its 10th edition at this particular point in time. Crime and the American Dream. It's just a beautiful title. It's a beautifully written work. I don't agree with every jot and tittle of it, but it makes a sort of a compelling case for these kinds of things, animating these kinds of processes.
Oh, go ahead, please.
So it looks at sort of an international comparison, and the idea here is that if we could have a well-funded, a better-funded social safety net, however defined, that you could undermine these kinds of motivations, and you could suppress and limit those kinds of things.
Well, talking about gangs again, I mean, if we were to have a better funded welfare state, like, for example, national health or something similar to that, it seems to me that in terms of competing for status, no one is going to show off their NHS card to a woman, right? Yeah. I mean, if that's what's motivating some of these criminals, they don't, I mean, when they need health care, they might be grateful if they have to have a bullet removed or something and get it all done for free, but that's not really going to give them much. And so if you're talking about maybe a UBI, then that would make more sense, but that's not necessarily what he's talking about, correct?
No. I think that they talk about, they reference, it's been a while since I've read the work. It's gone through, again, various iterations. And so my familiarity is largely within some of the earlier editions. So they would speak to things like, parental leave. They would talk about that. There's sort of competing interests that can be manipulated, or competing institutions. It's called institutional enemy theory. So you've got issues like the family vying for control or the opportunity to influence human behavior. You've got economic interests and you've got governmental interests, all sort of competing and vying for the opportunity or jockeying for space. And their argument essentially is that over time, the economic interests have come to suppress and elbow out all of those other interests, and this takes supremacy. So it's not, they've got all these great aphorisms written within the book. Like it's not how you play the game, it's whether or not you win or lose. And so they're attempting to illustrate to us that if that becomes a dominant modality of thinking, if that becomes conventional thinking, then you're essentially giving warrant to people who are not just interested in getting the NHS card, but figuring out ways in which to manipulate their way into becoming, I guess, sort of the prototypical kind of quote unquote welfare queen or something along those lines, right? It doesn't matter. The classic case that I typically use in teaching that kind of approach, or to get my students to understand that kind of mentality or that critique, is someone like Jay-Z, right? So, well, then I have to explain that Jay-Z is not even his real name. He grew up Sean Carter, and there's a great song where he's talking about selling dimes and nickels. And I'm telling my students, do you imagine that, going door to door trying to sell a dime or sell a nickel? Difficult work, right? Sort of tongue in cheek. He came up through the drug game, right? And now at this particular point in his career, he owns a label. He's a multimillionaire. He's actually been legitimized because he's been to the White House. He soirees with all the power players and all the legitimized social circles, with no mention of the fact of the allegations surrounding him. He self-admitted having dealt drugs. There's the charge of an attempted murder with a stabbing, if memory serves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so their argument here is that if you shift the balance too much in favor of this one thing, then that is going to be the excuse or offer leverage for those people to engage in those kinds of behavior. So take gang activity for one instance. There's a great book by Sudhir Venkatesh called Off the Books that gives indication that the sources of authority, legitimate, traditional, or typical legitimate authority by middle class standards, has completely collapsed in certain areas. And so what fills that power vacuum is the local gang. So they can use that kind of justification that they're depraved because they're deprived, because the classic notion here that who's going to want to work their neck as a working stiff at the local McDonald's if you see people outside your door flashing money, cash, attracting young women into your social orbit, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, some of that work was undermined by the empirical analysis provided by Sudhir Venkatesh with Stephen Levitt, where they look at gang ledgers. You may be familiar with this work.
Yes,
where they give
economics,
right. So they give some indication here that you're actually, there's a couple of myths in there in this particular trope, right? One is the one that you're leading down the path to, is that there's these greater chances of being either imprisoned, accumulating a criminal record, or worse yet, encountering physical harm and damage up to and including encountering death as a legitimate as an occupational hazard for pursuing that line of work. There's also within the gang literature an understanding that licit and illicit markets are arenas in which gang members will dip into and out of depending on the exigencies that they're facing in life. So it's not the case that an individual who is caught within these kinds of conditions will opt for one exclusively over the other. It's kind of a mix and match kind of proposition that's oftentimes used, which somewhat gives the lie to this argument, or the idea that it's the economy, stupid, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Well, the typical middle class person will look where the crime is, where it generally speaking is. They know which neighborhoods to avoid, that's for sure.
Yeah.
If they're familiar with where they live, they're not just passing through. And they'll notice that the crime is where the poor people are. So they make that instant correlation. But what I've always wanted to ask one of these middle class folks, especially if their son, it's typically males who engage in criminal behavior. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Well, not.
Yeah,
I don't know what the disparity. Yeah. Right, overwhelming, especially the crimes of violence and so forth. I always wanted them to take a look at their nerdy little son Josh, or whatever his name is, and ask them if they think that if their family had been growing up in poverty, that Josh would be a gang leader. And then you look at the young lad and you try to imagine that this nerdy kid is going to be slapping around somebody who hasn't paid off his debts or something. I've always wanted to see what the reaction would be. I don't think maybe a little light bulb would go off in their head.
Right.
It can't just be the poverty.
Yeah, I think that's a point that's worth emphasizing and re-emphasizing until we're all blue in the face. I remember overhearing something in the hall. I studied at an institution where this one of the leading gang experts, a guy named Scott Decker, wrote a fabulous book called Life in the Gang, detailing the lives of 99 gang members in the St. Louis area. He was once referring to some survey or something some work he was doing in South Central LA, or he was privy to some of that work. In that work, it was indicated that it's an exceptional rarity for someone who grew up in that particular neighborhood to actually become a gang member. So there are other factors that are involved with making those kinds of decisions. The point that you raise about this issue of facing that kind of environment day in and day out, I think also bears some measure of repeating. So in addition to this being an exceptionally rare occurrence, even in the most sort of gang-ridden neighborhood, you also face this issue of the culpability of those who are faced with these kinds of constraints and these kinds of difficulties in their life. There's a term I think it's called moral fatigue. The idea of moral fatigue is that, well, we find, for instance, that you're more likely to have purchased burgled items in certain kinds of neighborhoods. They sort of aggregate, or they cluster in certain kinds of neighborhoods. That's where you're most exposed to this. But survey evidence indicates that Survey evidence indicates that the more repeated offer, the more repeatedly you offer these kinds of goods, the more likely you are to, at some point, to accede to those kinds of temptations. And so that's where I think even the most rock-ribbed conservative would be inclined to accept some of those kinds of arguments, at the very least, at the margins, because you can imagine the scenario here, right? So playing around with this idea of biology, right? So let's say at some future point, we figure out how to clone someone like Tiger Woods, right? So should we expect a situation in which he's going to dominate or master this particular skill set yet again in the future? Well, you could sort of play around with this kind of idea of sort of a Skinnerian idea, if you will, that you put someone in a particular position, and you put someone else of the exact same physical makeup in another position, and you see how those trajectories either intersect at some future point or they diverge throughout whatever means or methodology there that would come to occur. But yeah, those are things that occupy more and more of our attention these days here, with this idea of what makes an individual resilient to those kinds of temptations, and how do we boost those capacities? How do we also recognize or diagnose those susceptibilities? So a lot of the public health stuff gets into sort of those kinds of measurements here, and kind of having these ledgers of pro and cons to figure out ways in which to manipulate, to the degree that they can, these kinds of environments in order to foreshadow or shift, put the thumb on the scale to produce better overall results. I never forget, it's one of the more poignant events in my life as a social scientist. I was working at the University of Chicago, and we were going out and interviewing kids in these really difficult positions in life. We went out to a school out on the western periphery of Chicago. I think it was Westinghouse, sitting down with this absolute giant of a kid. He was 17, but he must have been 6'5", and somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 pounds. I was sitting there chatting with him about what do you do after school, what motivates that, how do you make a decision about this, that, or the other. And he's explaining to me just getting out of the neighborhood presented physical challenges to him and having to deal with these confrontations. And at that moment, I felt about like this tall here, thinking about like, what would I do in this kid's position? It's still kind of bearing on my imagination at this point. But yeah, those are tough questions.
Right. Well, one thing that occurs to me, sort of fundamental question, do people create culture, or does culture create people? But we also have to realize that every person that's born into these poor neighborhoods is not the one creating the culture. Yep. He's going to grow up in that world. But you can still ask the question, who's creating this culture? And I know that's a hard question to answer.
Oh,
but
God.
That's something that makes me think.
Yeah, it's $1 million question. There's been various attempts to kind of unearth a more definitive, a more discrete answer to that. There was I think it was called the Gautreaux Project in Chicago, where they were by lottery placing some families here and some families there, and some families just simply didn't win the lottery as it was designed. There was a bunch of work that came out of Hurricane Katrina it's sort of a natural experiment where people were just unfortunately displaced as a result of that, to see what kinds of trajectories happen. Would they recreate those kinds of environments? Would they be drawn to those same kinds of moral hazards, or would they repel those? There's always been an attempt to figure out how to test poverty, because white poverty looks different than African American poverty. White poverty is is geographically distinct in a lot of ways. African American poverty tends to be much more layered, much more concentrated. There's a famous and enduring account of that uses a word called multiple marginality, that looks at the multiple hurdles that those who are in environments where there is ensconced poverty that is intergenerational. It doesn't seem to be evident in the data that there's a parallel experience in the sort of the white, if you will, experiential base. I don't know. It's been a while since I've touched a lot of that stuff, but one would wonder whether or not there is an analog with Appalachian existence, if you will. To what degree does that map or not map? What kinds of pathologies? You look at somebody like, I don't know, Kevin Williamson in popular, within the popular realm, whether or not his insights or his suggestion that poverty is poverty seems to bear out or not. He seems to focus attention on a lot of these pathologies. So it's an enduring debate. There's always this sort of like this, it's almost like the Anchorman fight with the News Channel 4 versus News Channel 6 kind of thing, with the structural folks and the cultural folks trying to figure out which is it that is actually animating this as a problem.
Hold on now, Brendan. You promised us a definitive answer.
Right, I suppose I did it? Yeah. See, a lot about this is just figuring out how to frame a question in such a way that you can get in a sense of what's actually happening. So I think to the degree that we can come up with more sophisticated methodologies, to the degree that we can take advantage of these historical happenstances as they arise, to the degree that we can study these programs and that are somewhat randomized in a way, those are opportunities for us to kind of dive in and get a better handle on precisely what's going on here. So because we do want to break those habits. There seems to be I got into a little bit of this with my interview with Adrian Rain.
I was just coming to him.
Yeah, so brief introduction here, maybe save us the time at the future point there. Very much on the biosocial realm of things. He emphasized to me that there seems to be a common misconception in his view of what we're doing here in the social sciences, a common misconception that just because it's culture means that it's much more malleable, it's much more easy, lends itself much more readily to some productive manipulation. And he wanted to push back against that. And I think that's a point, well worth pondering within the field.
Well, I did read his book. Well, I guess he has more than one, but his more recent book, I believe. And he says we can locate criminology in the brain.
Yeah.
Like he talks about people who lack omega-3 nutrition, I think.
Yep.
Basically, they don't eat enough fish. So he sees a correlation there. I don't know if he's correct about that, but that's very interesting.
A lot of folks made big news about lead. So the EPA pulling out lead out of the gasoline that's belching this out into the world. Lead paint in all these lower class communities has yet to be extracted from that environment in a purposeful and intentional way.
It was basically admitting that this crime is not really so much about poverty in terms of deprivation so much as it is the result of pollution, which goes against, the idea put forth in West Side Story and I guess a lot of criminology in general, correct?
Yeah, and if we went further down that path, then we're back to where we began here with this question of human nature and free will, right? Because no one opts into an environment in which they're going to be exposing themselves to contagion that are going to be unintentionally messing with their own intellectual well-being here, right? So there's questions about how much of an imposition. There's a great story he tells in the Anatomy of Violence about this.
You're talking about Rain, correct?
Yeah, Adrian Rain, R-A-I-N-E, for those who are just tuning in. So Rain tells a story, you may recall this, about this middle-aged man who at one particular point in time develops sexual affinity for his own daughter. And so this is strange no one knows where this particular urge is emanating from. He's never expressed that desire prior to this particular thing. They do a brain scan, and they find out that there's something impinging on some part of his brain. A lot of brain's work is beyond me because it's like 16-letter words of these chemical compositions and these hyper locations within the brain. Nevertheless, there's something going on that is beyond his own control. So they fix this issue. We're done. He's sort of in counseling. He's made peace with this as an issue. And then those feelings ultimately reemerge. They say, well, we better check this out again. And then there's been a reemergence of this. So there seems to be a pretty thick correlation here between the appearance of this physical abnormality and the expression of some abnormal human desire here, right? So that really puts a fine point on what's actually happening here. And he wrestles with a lot of that in the latter part of the book. I think he has a really nice term for this. It's Lombroso program or something like that.
Quickly explain who Lombroso was.
Oh, right. Okay. So Lombroso was one of the first to crib a lot of what Charles Darwin was doing and invest some of that kind of effort, apply and graft some of that effort into social science. So he's been in many ways a maligned figure. In other ways, there's a lot of justifications for the pushback against some of his work, arguably most famously by Robert K. Merton. Some of his work changed over the course of his lifespan, where he began inserting into his framework less of a definitive weddedness to biology as the single explanatory factor. He was responsible as a prison physician in Italy for measuring all sorts of aspects of the human composition at that particular point in time, made a testimony to this in his famous book called The Criminal Man, was ultimately picked apart. There's a famous pushback against him using statistical analyses that said and accounted for kids at Cambridge having more of these statistical associations than his prison population here. So clearly there's an issue here in terms of the Italian scene, northern versus southern. So those cultural elements were expressed in the disproportionate overrepresentation of those from the South under his purview, subjected to his analytic framework. So that story fell apart pretty quickly over the course of time. The coup de grace for all that was the final solution, where a lot of those ideas got rolled into Nazi ideology. And so anything that touches or hints in that direction was essentially dead on arrival as an intellectual argument for quite some time. That has ultimately reemerged in a contemporary scene. There's been enough historical distance, there's been enough memory decay on that, and there's been some fascinating breakthroughs within biology. And I think the allure for criminology is just too great. For one, there's testable propositions, there's new data, so let's be a part of the party. The second motivation, I think, is, in fairness, an attempt to be a part of the conversation so they can shape the conversation from within, to avoid those kinds of implications from actually being expressed at some future point. So they figure if they're within that ambit, they can hopefully forestall at the very least, if not outright preclude, those kinds of implications from occurring at some future point. It remains to be seen whether or not that will actually happen.
Are you euphemistically referring to cancel culture? Isn't that a sort of cancel culture in a way?
No, I'm referring to the fact that totalitarian governments have no inclination to avoid using that kind of data. I don't think this might sound somewhat conspiratorial. There's probably efforts already underway in some countries to clone human individuals. Experimentation of all sorts probably occurring in some far-flung laboratories all across the world. So it remains to be seen what is ultimately going to result from that kind of thing.
Well, I just meant that maybe criminology, because it has certain ideological priors, or that some criminologists do, that they would want to stamp that out, the Adrian Raine approach or the biological approach to crime, because they would sort of go into politically unattractive directions.
That's always a touchy issue. I think what has been the saving grace of that particular approach is that the caricature of Lombroso, of some mad scientist with test tubes and beakers in biology, is the definitive thing, and they will tolerate of no other explanatory elements, is a bygone entity. So it's wed itself to this sort of integration. A lot of this is about like epigenetic kind of stuff, about how genes and environment actually interact. There's a famous back and forth within our flagship journal called Criminology. And one of the leaders of that, one of the primary players in that back and forth, a guy named Ron Simons, I remember he came to the University of Iowa and gave a little presentation on some of the stuff that he did. I was in the sociology department. So he does stuff. He uses these kinds of indicators. He tracks and traces and puts these into statistical analyses. And he began his presentation with an explanation that the journal, I forget whether it was Nature or Science, but one of those two major publications, had an editorial. And the editorial essentially said that the discoveries yet to be made in terms of what shapes human behavior has to include some measure of biology, and it also has to include some measure of social science here. They were reaching the point of diminishing returns with the application of biology in that context. So the social scientists were being encouraged in this editorial to take more of the lead here in terms of figuring out where stressors. So you could look at like a public health model, for instance, looking at macro trends with regard to what the immunologists are interested in, the expansion or the growing numbers of immunocompromised people, right? So more and more cases emerging over the course of time. Why is that? We have to look at just sort of behavioral patterns to get some indication of that. The same thing I think applies with regard to explaining criminal behavior too. So it's no longer the sort of cut and dried, we will tolerate of no other position other than biology. The biosocial is an attempt to make peace with sociologists, to bring sociologists and those who are inclined towards those kinds of first order propositions into the conversation to make it a more productive collaboration as opposed to a battle. It's been very surprising how that's taken place, even within sociology. Sociology is very much committed to this idea that it's all a social construct. And you find this sort of the Goffmanic position still has its adherence within criminology. You have a critical camp that is very deeply suspicious of this kind of thing as well, with who's going to have the power over making these kinds of determinations, especially as genetic testing begins getting underway, especially in utero, what happens in utero. A lot of effort. There's a famous paper, I think Alex Picaro was in on this paper, one of the most published, one of the most cited, actually, if not the most cited criminal criminologist, explains how prenatal smoking has an impact. That's something that the child did not opt into. that has a bearing long term in terms of elevating the prospects of delinquent and criminal behavior. So there is an interplay. There is an acceptance for biology and how it can be like Adrian Rain talking about figuring out how to get kids to eat fish, maybe to increase their omega-3s and all those kinds of things. The same thing played itself out within the IQ debate, for instance. A lot of that results from malnutrition. So maybe golden rice is the thing to use, or whatever the case may be with the genetically modified thing here, right, to increase access to foodstuffs to avoid those kinds of deficits to the full fruition of human expression and those innate talents is something that we all got to be aware of.
It's very likely the case that poor nutrition might contribute to mental deficits like low IQ, but it seems to be a fact, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that low IQ does correlate fairly strongly with criminality, correct?
Yeah, it's not much talked about. There's a paper by Terry Moffat, as she's seen in print, that notes after sort of sophisticated methodological controls that the average individual who's engaged in criminal behavior is about 8 points short of the standardized norm of 100. So there's a bunch of different factors that play into that. Some of those are social. Some of those are biological, and I mean biological in a rather broad sense. Your genetic endowment certainly plays a role, but also the issues of malnutrition, which will in fact impact your ability to process things in an adequate or peak at your peak of cognitive potential. So those are things that I think ought to be dealt with. There are traumas that many kids who live in some of these kinds of neighborhoods that we were talking about a little earlier that have a negative impact on one's psychological, mental, and cognitive well-being. There's a growing body of evidence of that. So figuring out ways in which to put people in more peaceable conditions, putting kids in two-parent families, two-parent households, stable environments, figuring out ways in which to break the intergenerational transmission of poverty and economic well-being, better schools, et cetera, right? All those things can increase one's physiological well-being to produce better overall outcomes.
Is that well accepted, or is that just? I mean, it's all theoretical.
I think it is, but I'm speaking rather broadly here, right? So, I mean, I've included nearly everything under the sun, which is very frustrating for us in terms of which is the lever that you want to pull hardest on, which means oftentimes neglecting some other issue.
Because when you make a list like that, it sounds like you're talking about the Great Society 2.0 in some ways. I'm not sure the Great Society was all that great to start with, but that's my point of view.
Yeah, so, when you're outlining your earlier proposition there with the health access to healthcare and all that, I was immediately thinking of moral hazards of various sorts here, right? So, yeah, there are. It's a complex kind of phenomenon. It's exceptionally difficult to arrive at a definitive solution to any of these issues. Once again, I go back to the earlier idea that the better way to approach a lot of this stuff is figuring out ways in which to frame things, to frame a question, to figure out ways in which we can narrow in on something that we can sort of more definitively say that we know about, quote unquote, know about, and then make that actionable intelligence. Because there's a vast divide. It's like basic science and applied science, right? So you can understand that COVID-19 looks like this and it acts in this way, right? That's great, right? That's a fantastic discovery. But that doesn't mean that the very next day that we're going to be able to apply those insights to figure it out. Here's how you eradicate this from the face of the earth. It's a slippery question. It's like a riddle in a lot of ways. So the problem of crime, going back to Durkheim here, right? It was one of the more arresting moments in my intellectual journey, reading a short little distillation of his explanation of functionalism. Imagine a society of saints. This is the idea here that the Mayflower had people who were destined by God. They were the select of humanity. They were going to create this enlightened civilization, people living in absolute harmony with one another. But wouldn't you know it, the Puritan community out in early Massachusetts encountered a moral crisis of sorts, and they began behaving exceptionally badly to one another, to understate the case. There's a famous book written on this that applies that Durkheimian framework. It's called Wayward Puritans. So it explains how we generate these kinds of reactions. We would designate certain kinds of behaviors as criminal, and we react to that as if it were the case. And so there seems to be an innate need for that in some capacity. That's the way that he explains it. The whole notion of functionalism is that it serves a function. It serves it has a proactive value, right? I feel better about myself because I'm not like that X community or X people who engage in these kinds of behaviors. I'm avoiding that.
Hester Prynne.
Right? I mean, that's how things work. That's how the sort of human psychology works. We gravitate towards groups. We are innately nativistic in our leanings. So I would argue that it's an impossible riddle to solve definitively and forevermore. Now, there are people, I'm sympathetic to a lot of these arguments. There's a particular paradigm called routine activities. And routine activities will take a particular typology of behavior and look to figure out definitive solutions that will break apart the connectivity of a motivated offender, a lack of a suitable guardian, and a target, all in space and time. And so you pull out one of those, and then you don't have any problem anymore. And so target hardening has worked in many instances. There's all sorts of structural redesigns that can be instituted.
Can you give some examples?
One of the things that they point out is buses in the UK. And so buses in the UK would be subjected to robberies from time to time. And so the target there
on the top half or the lower half of the bus?
What's that?
On the top half or the lower half of the bus?
Well, depending on where you keep the money, right? So that the money would essentially at some point be sort of sucked out. It would be put in a safe underneath the bus, and only one person at the shop has the key to this thing. And so that would cut down on that. He talked about like watering down beer at sporting events after the fifth inning or something like that. And so that takes away some of the motivation for people to get really big ears and really big muscles, right? After 6 or 7 brews. There was a really genius one about, I think they called them tankards. So they're at bars, fights would break out. And so one of the things that you could use, kind of like in is it Billy Madison, where he breaks the bottle over and he says, "Let's go." So they craft these containers that will immediately just sort of beat up. It's sort of like safety glass, and so that takes away. It makes a deadly instrument a more benign instrument. These are things that LoJack, for instance, something that could be immediately used. I always want. So just down the way in Georgetown, one of the first places that was targeted by the recent protest riots, however you want to frame it, was the Apple Store. And so I'm thinking, like, why would anybody go into the Apple Store and attempt to steal anything, right? I mean, presumably that could all be tracked, for one, and presumably that could all be immediately immobilized in terms of its usability remotely. So clearly you eliminate those kinds of incentives. So there is some hope for those kinds of things to be actually activated and used in some realistic way in order to eliminate those kinds of behaviors. So some people dismiss that. The critics of that particular approach dismiss that as what they call administrative criminology, using quotes here, in some ways to indicate that you're just sort of a tool of the state. The state says that we don't want the private property is immoral in some capacity, whatever, yada yada yada. So the government tells you that you got to fix this, and so you're just sort of a patsy of the state. Go out and do the state bidding. So it gets back to that larger issue embedded in the explanation of crime, or what is criminology, a three-part definition: the systematic study, the motivation for crime, the defining of crime, and the reaction to the breaking of laws. So power still plays a factor.
I want to ask you, since we're coming up on an hour now, I just want to ask you a personal question.
Sure.
Do you believe that your field has made progress? That's number one. And number two, in your private moments, even though you know there's all these controversies as far as what is the true, what is the cause of crime, do you feel that you personally have answered some of those questions for yourself in a satisfactory manner?
Yeah. Okay. So those are very good questions, by the way. The first question is somewhat complicated. I'm a big fan of Steven Pinker's tome, The Better Angels of Our Nature. And so I think as part of that larger macro, I would even call it an anthropological approach, with the breathtaking amount of time he begins sort of Cro-Magnon man, looking at the skeletal remains and things of that nature in terms of his narrative. Over the course of time, I am firmly convinced that we are figuring out ways collectively to be nicer, to be more ecumenical, to be more accepting of one another. Although, as we're discovering now, civilization is a rather thin veneer, are we not? I think collectively there have been breakthroughs. I think there have been discoveries that have illustrated to us and demonstrated beyond skepticism here that we're doing better at this. Now, to the degree that criminology and criminal justice as a science is contributing to that, I think it's more of a debatable proposition. I've cited this paper for a while now. There's a paper by Weisberg and Porcaro that gives indication that our R-squares, our ability to explain variance in criminal behavior, has actually been declining over the course of time. So from a scientific standpoint, they're using that as an indication that, folks, we need to have a conversation about perfecting our craft. On my more dour days, I am all on board with that message and saying, what are we doing wrong? How do we fix this thing? How do we get this thing on a better trajectory? On other days, I'm a little less charitable to that argument, in that I think that some of the data have been improving over the course of the years. Some of our statistical methodology have undoubtedly been improving as well. And so we're probably digging down into the sort of the asymptote here in terms of we're getting closer and closer to a definitive or a more conclusive answer of sorts. Of course, I'm still not satisfied that I'm sort of anti-intellectual in a lot of ways. I've got a lot of sort of Hayekian kind of inclinations here in terms of where I'm at with a lot of this. In terms of the belief that one individual can contain all the mysteries and the permutations of how we understand or approach or even frame this as a question cannot be contained within any one individual's mind. And so that's why I go back to Steven Pinker's work as illustrative of this grand collective project. There's a great there's a great piece of work. I forget which book of his this is in. There's a guy named Philip Kitcher at Columbia. I think he's just recently retired, and he talks about science as this larger macro cultural, macro historical collective project that we're all sort of in our own incremental fashion, in our own piecemeal fashion, contributing to in some tiny, insignificant way. And so in that sense, I think it'd be better for us to think about this less as sort of an intellectual project in terms of who's going to come up with the most fantastic model, although that all plays a role, and I don't want to deny the importance or negate the importance. I'm not throwing shade here at any of those people who are doing that. I think it would just be helpful to allow for more of an opportunity to kind of rethink our purpose and the role of science here in terms of how business is being conducted. There was a great piece of work, I forget where this appeared. I think Rob Sampson at Harvard made an argument at one particular point in time that talked about like public health improvements as one means in which violence and crime has actually been reduced over the course of time. We wouldn't necessarily think of those kinds of things within our way of doing things, because it's police, courts, and corrections, or the technocratic way in which we deal with this. Those are the experts. Let them do it. We'll allow them to manipulate and gather and tweak data in the ways in which they do in order to arrive at some firm conclusions. I think it's a much more multifaceted project with a capital P that we're all engaged in. So I think a little intellectual humility on our part, I think would go a long way in terms of not over-promising things, as well as putting some cap on our sort of visions of utopia in some sense. I think that's probably the best way forward. So a lot of my work right now is about trying to figure out how the science actually operates. I think the next stage in my career will begin looking at being more assertive and more declarative in my pronouncements here in terms of here's maybe a better path forward. So the first step in the process for me has been to sort of problematize or say that, well, there's some weaknesses here in terms of how we're handling things. I've got a paper out in the British Journal of Criminology with a co-author of mine who actually does a lot of really good police work, Sean Goodison. So he's got his foot in the empirical realm, talking to people who are actually going out and making arrests and dealing with the nitty-gritty of life, where we explain that the field is not falsifying at arguably an acceptable rate. So we craft these propositions, ideally with the notion that we could put these in the field and test them, and then ultimately negate them if they are proved to be ineffective or wanting in some way. We're not doing arguably enough of that. There's a sort of a softer approach to falsifying things within our field, less of a definitive moment. There's a very little kind of eureka moment where we can either prove up or down a particular proposition. So that's what makes this difficult, because everybody will go say, okay, so Lee, you've got this model and you're saying all these things here, and you've got sort of 7 things that you want to test. So he tests them and they come out to be sort of wishy-washy, or maybe you've even got some statistically significant results. Then some smart aleck from the back of the room can always come forward and say, no, you didn't test these other 6 things that I think could be influencing or impacting the results that you got. So your results are biased in some fundamental way. Those are the conversations. Those are the kinds of fights that we have within criminology. Not enough of an attempt, arguably. Then again, I think there are inherent limitations in our ability to say, like, okay, so poverty, right? So it's poverty. Well, what the heck do you mean by poverty? Like, what is it about that particular term that we're actually going to go out and actually with a clipboard and make little tick marks and actually definitively calculate here in terms of how impoverished one is or is not. Social sciences are much more difficult than the natural sciences. We don't have those kinds of tools. We don't have those methodologies. So therefore, we're wanting on those sort of definitive litmus tests of sorts. So we're kind of stuck with the aggregation of the human experience in an attempt to kind of sift through these tea leaves and arrive at some sort of semblance of a sense of like what's going on here, right? We know that murder is going up in a lot of the major cities in this country. That's pretty clear, pretty definitive. But then again, we're going to have some muddied issues. Chicago famously kind of mucking intentionally with their own homicide data. So the politics again sort of inserts itself in this complicated scenario here.
Well, Brendan Dooley, thank you so much for your time.
I appreciate you folks having me on. It's interesting being on this side of the interview experience as opposed to the other. So appreciate the opportunity.
Sure. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And thank you, the listeners and viewers, for tuning in to the LocoFoco Netcast. This has been the 20th episode. You can find this podcast on Brighteon, BitChute, and YouTube as a video, and hosted as audio at LocoFoco.net. It is, of course, available via a number of podcatchers, including those by Apple, Google, podcatchers, and Spotify. Drop us a line at locofoco.us or locofoco.locals.com. Thank you.